Go ahead, Dr. P.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the closing session of our conference on Holocaust education today. I'm really grateful that so many of you have joined us throughout these past several days, and we've heard some outstanding presentations. And tonight will be no exception. I'm very much looking forward to Father Walter Kedjierski's reflections on Fratelli Tutti this evening. It will be a perfect way to end our conference. So with that, I will turn it over to Helene Peharik, who will introduce the Bishop of Greensburg.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome. I am Helene Peharik, a Seton Hill alumni and professor of theology at St. Vincent Seminary. It's my honor to facilitate this closing session of the Ethel Lefrock Conference on Holocaust Education today. Our closing session is entitled Fratelli Tutti, a call to unity in a fractured world, presented by Father Walter Kedjierski. This session serves as a response to our learning over these past several days, and it proposes a way forward beyond extremism, hate, and denial. Father Kajersky's presentation reflects upon Pope Francis's vision of human fraternity as a remedy for the divisive and emotive dissonance experienced in many societies, and offers a proposal for the cultivation of a culture of care. Especially because our topic tonight is on dialogue and friendly relations, I heartily encourage you to actively participate in tonight's session. Please locate the chat icon on the top right corner of your screen. There you can make comments and ask questions during the presentation. Please share your questions and thoughts so that we all may enjoy a robust dialogue. Tonight, we are truly delighted to have with us the 6th Bishop of the Diocese of Greensburg, Pennsylvania, Bishop Larry J. Kulik, who will formally introduce our presenter, Father Kajersky. Bishop Kulik is a graduate of St. Vincent Seminary and earned a doctorate in canon law at the Catholic University of America. Bishop Kulik is a trustee of Seton Hill University and a member of the advisory board of the National Catholic Center for Holocaust Education at Seton Hill. Please join me in welcoming Bishop Kulik, who will introduce our presenter.
Thank you very much, Helene, and it is indeed an honor and a privilege for me to be here this evening, and a special privilege to introduce our speaker for this evening, and that is Father Walter Kedjierski. Father is the Executive Director of the Secretariat for Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. He will base his presentation this evening on Fratelli Tutti, the 2020 Encyclical letter of Pope Francis. Father Walter F. Kedjierski was ordained a priest of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Rockville Center on June 8th, 2002. The highlight of his years of ministry has been as a parish priest and pastor. He also served on the faculty of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at St. John's University in New York, and as an adjunct professor of dogmatic and ecumenical theology at St. Joseph's Seminary, New York. He was a research assistant to Bishop William Murphy when he served on the Pontifical Commission for Interreligious Dialogue, a member of the board of the Interfaith Center of the Islamic Center of Long Island, and director of the Office of Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs of the Diocese of Rockville Center. Father Kajersky was rector, director of diaconate formation, and director of the Sacred Heart Institute for Continuing Formation of Clergy at the Seminary of the Immaculate Conception in Huntington, New York. He currently serves as the executive director of the Secretariat for Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops in Washington, D.C. Father Kajersky earned his PhD in dogmatic spiritual theology from the Graduate Theological Foundation in Indiana in 2016. He has published numerous articles on theological, ecumenical, and pastoral topics in a wide range of journals. His latest was entitled Dialogue as Exchange of Gifts, Catholic-Jewish Rapprochement in the Light of American Social Tensions, which appeared in the July and August 2021 issue of Ecumenical Trends. It is indeed my pleasure, my privilege, and with great anticipation that I now introduce to you Father Walter Kedjierski.
Thank you so much, Bishop Kulik. I had mentioned to Jim and Helene that as a staff member for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, usually I'm the one introducing the bishops. So it's certainly been a reverse in this case, given that our role is to serve the bishops. And truly, I'd like to start by saying what a privilege it is to be able to be with you this evening in order to offer some reflections and to enter into some dialogue about this document that I think is so very important for us in this day and age, Fratelli Tutti, and to reflect in light of what we've experienced over the past few days on how we might be able to build together what Pope Francis described in his letter for the World Day of Peace in 2021 as a culture of care, to cultivate together a culture of care in response to the tragedies that sadly we've seen around us and we have reflected upon during our time together. And so we'll begin with I have a PowerPoint presentation that will just guide us along. I hope that you can all see. So let us enter into this reflection. I'll just offer you a few reflections as I prayed with this text. And I do hope, as Helene mentioned, that at the conclusion of the presentation, you might be eager to offer your own views as we work together to cultivate a culture of care. When I first read this Encyclical Fratelli Tutti, a document that seemed to me to be a synthesis of all of the past writings of Pope Francis and in fact his entire pontificate, I kept on being reminded of a story from Christian antiquity. It's said that when John the Evangelist was on his deathbed, he couldn't help himself but continually repeat over and over again the same phrase, love one another. Love one another. And it certainly stands to reason that an author that could write such sentiments as you see on the slide, God is love and those who live in love live in God, God lives in them. And whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar, could possibly leave his band of faithful followers with the words of the greatest commandment as his parting message. After reading and reflecting upon this encyclical, which has rightly gained so much attention, not only in the Catholic world, but also in interfaith context, I believe we can very simply summarize its message with those final sentiments of St. John. Love one another. Love one another. Those words seem so simple. Their simplicity, in a sense, is also their genius. Verbosity tends to obscure, and Pope Francis has offered plenty of examples in this encyclical of people using words to justify excluding one community or another from love. The message seems simple, yet if it's so simple, why haven't we learned it yet? During the past few days, we've not only reflected on tragic moral failures like the Holocaust, but also the tragedy of anti-Semitism, other forms of bigotry and hatred that all manifest themselves today. Unfortunately, this conference has highlighted that many have really still not heeded those words. Love one another. There's still much that needs to be done, I think we all agree. Pope Francis's answer through this encyclical is to invite the whole world into an inclusive, respectful dialogue. Undoubtedly, listening is a fundamental part of loving another person. When one is listened to, one feels valued. The potential for wider dialogue and greater listening should offer all of humanity hope. That potential should offer us hope. And we see it here on Fratelli Tutti 55. Pope Francis says, I invite everyone to a renewed hope. For hope speaks to us of something deeply rooted in every human heart, independent of our circumstances and historical conditioning. Hope speaks to us of a thirst, an aspiration, a longing for a life of fulfillment, a desire to achieve great things, things that fill our hearts and lift our spirit to lofty realities like truth, goodness, beauty, justice, and love. Although his words are meant to have a particularly strong gravitas for Christians, Pope Francis is inviting all of us, Fratelli Tutti, as brothers and sisters, to abide in this hope. He wrote, although I have written this encyclical from the Christian convictions that inspire and sustain me, I've sought to make this reflection an invitation to dialogue among all people of goodwill. By using that phrase of his special patron, St. Francis, Pope Francis is coming to us, despite his being the Bishop of Rome, as our brother Francis. As a brother, he's calling all of us, Catholic or not Catholic, to be brothers and sisters to each other. He's invited us to enter into a conversation with him about how we can love one another. So let's take some time this evening to continue the conversation with each other. So we'll move on to the next slide. Fratelli Tutti is Pope Francis's attempt to help all of humanity to love one another. So we're going to, for this evening, take four points that I gathered in my reflection on the encyclical to help us with this promotion of dialogue that could help us to love one another. First, we're going to be looking at the dialogical methodology of Fratelli Tutti in and of itself. A lot of times we look at a document and we discern what the content is, but do we take the time perhaps to ask, well, how was this document written? What was the method behind it? And I think you'll find that the method behind the writing of Fratelli Tutti is indeed not only intriguing, but unique when it comes to the writing of encyclicals. After we consider Fratelli Tutti as a document that is dialogical in and of itself, we'll see a few steps offered by Pope Francis to enter into dialogue, looking into the periphery, renouncing an induced blindness that dulls the conscience, and viewing human life as a supreme value. So let's start off our time together by looking at the unique dialogical character of Fratelli Tutti. As we think about this, we first should ask ourselves the question, what is an encyclical? An encyclical is an authoritative document that is written as a letter from the Pope, from the Bishop of Rome. Pope Paul VI, who wrote the Encyclical Ecclesiam Suum, an encyclical which really started the Catholic Church in the direction of embracing dialogue with the world, described when he released that encyclical, an encyclical as a document in the form of a letter sent by the Pope to the bishops of the entire world. Encyclicals are meant to be addresses to bishops from the Bishop of Rome. Interestingly, though, when we look at Fratelli Tutti, we see that this encyclical, in of itself is a document that is written by Pope Francis for everyone, for all of humanity, regardless of our religious beliefs, regardless of where we're coming from. We see that it engaged Muhammad Mahmoud Abdel Salam, a Muslim who is the General Secretary of the Higher Committee on Human Fraternity in Abu Dhabi. He would say of the encyclical, with much love and enthusiasm and in agreement with the Pope, I share every word he has written in this encyclical. As we look at the encyclical, we see that Pope Francis at times makes an effort to engage people who have different perspectives than his own, and he tries to understand the lens through which they view reality, and address where they are coming from. Like this one quote from paragraph 214 from the encyclical, he says, to agnostics, this foundation could prove sufficient to confer a solid and stable universal validity on basic and non-negotiable ethical principles. And so we see here how Pope Francis considers the perspective of the other and tries to engage. As we think about the dialogical character of the encyclical, another thing to consider is that normally encyclicals are written in the mater lingua of the Catholic Church, namely Latin. But in this case, the encyclical is written in Spanish, a language that is commonly used in this day and age. As we think about Pope Francis offering this encyclical to the whole world, we might be tempted to wonder, what is he trying to do here? Might he have some sort of desire to dominate the critical moral and political conversations facing humanity? Actually, when one looks at the encyclical's tone in and of itself, one can recognize there is a certain tone there, a tone of respect, a tone of dialogue, a tone that says, let us discuss this as dialogue partners. Pope Francis would say, I offer this encyclical as a modest contribution to continued reflection in the hope that in the face of present-day attempts to eliminate or ignore others, we may prove capable of responding with a new vision of fraternity and social friendship that will not remain at the level of words. As we look at the encyclical, we see that Pope Francis takes seriously this idea of engaging the other in dialogue in his own reflections. As you think about this, we see in the encyclical, he talks about individuals such as Greek Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew I of Constantinople, Sheikh Dr. Ahmad Muhammad Al-Tayeb, the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar University and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo. And he credits as inspirations for the encyclical Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, Desmond Tutu, amongst others. The document even includes with both an ecumenical Christian prayer and a prayer meant for use by people from other religious traditions. Truly, this document is a clear example of how to enter into dialogue. The encyclical functions in a way that the Second Vatican Council envisioned for the Church, namely that the Church would offer to mankind the honest assistance of the Church in fostering the brotherhood of all people. So we see here this fulfillment of a vision that was already laid by Paul VI in Ecclesiam Suum, who said, it seems, and this is back in the 1960s, it seems to us that the sort of relationship for the church to establish with the world should be more in the nature of a dialogue, though theoretically other methods are not excluded. So it is fulfilling this vision of Gaudium et Spes, the honest assistance of the church in fostering that brotherhood of all, which corresponds to this destiny of theirs. That is the goal that is offered in the Second Vatican Council, and we see it so beautifully realized in this encyclical. So one of the points that Pope Francis emphasizes is that we need to think about Saint Francis. The term Fratelli Tutti, let us all brothers, comes from the sixth admonition that Saint Francis of Assisi would make to his brothers, to those who are in his community seeking to radically follow Christ, radically follow the gospel. And I thought it would be helpful for all of us to look at that sixth admonition from which Pope Francis entitled the encyclical. Perhaps looking at that might give us greater insight into the encyclical. So this is the quote: "Let us all, brothers, look to the good shepherd who suffered the passion of the cross to save his sheep. The sheep of the Lord followed him in tribulation and persecution, in insult and hunger, in infirmity and temptation, and in everything else, and they have received everlasting life from the Lord because of these things. Therefore, it is a great shame for us, servants of God, that while the saints actually did such things, we wish to receive glory and honor merely recounting their deeds." And so you look at that and you wonder, what was Pope Francis thinking in writing this encyclical inspired by his namesake, St. Francis? And we see he's definitely saying here, let's not just talk, let's act. Let us act with compassion. Let us act with mercy. Let us even be willing to suffer for the sake of the other, out of concern for the other. So this document clearly sets the tone that we shouldn't be stuck in our own heads. He's calling us, as St. Francis called his brothers, to go outside of our own self-imposed isolations or encampments and really engage those in tribulation or persecution. St. Francis certainly did this with his own life. You know, many Catholic school children associate St. Francis with his love of animals and nature, and that's a beautiful thing. Certainly, Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si addresses this dimension of St. Francis's spirituality. Yet a deeper, more central dimension to the spiritual life of St. Francis was his going out into the periphery, reaching out to those that many did not want to reach out to. St. Francis certainly reached out to individuals that no one noticed, and that experience transformed him. You remember that St. Francis was born of a successful merchant and chose to renounce his privileged life, portrayed so graphically by Giotto in his fresco depicting Francis handing back the very clothes on his back to his father. At the end of his life, when St. Francis was preparing for the end, he prepared a last testament, which he didn't have material possessions to others, but he did have spiritual treasures that he wanted to share. And in that last testament, we have this book, Edith van den Gordberg and Theodore Zwerman, respectfully yours, signed and sealed, Francis of Assisi, aspects of his authorship and spirituality, in which they reflect upon the writings of St. Francis. And this is what they say about that last testament. Indeed, much more had happened in the relatively long period during which Francis was turning away from his former lifestyle and turning toward God, as the biographies tell us. But in the testament, Francis focuses exclusively on the turnabout that was set in motion by his contact with lepers. Why this preference? For instance, why does he not mention that in the same period He had prayed before the cross of San Damiano and heard a call to go and repair Christ's house. The most obvious explanation is that this encounter with outcasts was decisive for him. We see no reason to doubt this. Even so, the very place of the story about the encounter with lepers, as well as the way Francis tells it and subsequently connects it with his idea about respect for corrupt church ministers, points to the intention that he had in composing his last testament. So St. Francis goes out into the periphery. He reaches out to the lepers that no one wants to reach out to, and that experience touches him. That experience transforms him and renews his life to the point where he feels that he needs to be all about service to building a better world and leading people to God. And as we think about that, Pope Francis highlights in Fratelli Tutti an instance of St. Francis going out into the periphery, that moment in which he visited Sultan Malik el-Kamil in Egypt. Back in 2019, before we all had to go into the pandemic mode, we celebrated the 800th anniversary of that visit. It's amazing to think about it. And Pope Francis highlights how this is a fellow who was in the Crusades at one point. He had challenges of poverty, scarce resources, great differences of language, culture, and religion. But nevertheless, he was motivated to go out into the periphery, to reach the other. It's one thing when you read about another. It's one thing when you hear about another from people who are in your group, who are in your perhaps own comfortable situation. But to actually go out to the other and see the other face to face, that can change things. That can be transformative. And so this document really invites us sometimes to be uncomfortable, but to be willing to cross boundaries and to try to encounter the other. So that's one step that we can see really is highlighted in terms of our desire to enter into dialogue and to do our best to encounter the other, to build a culture of healing, culture of care. The next step is renouncing an induced blindness. Pope Francis specifically warns in this encyclical about the danger of withdrawing into our own pseudo-realities, a danger which seems to be easier and easier to fall into. He says in paragraph 47, true wisdom demands an encounter with reality. Today, however, everything can be created, disguised, and altered. A direct encounter, even with the fringes of reality, can thus prove intolerable. A mechanism of selection then comes into play, whereby I can immediately separate likes from dislikes, what I consider attractive from what I deem distasteful. In the same way, we can choose the people with whom we wish to share our world. Persons or situations we find unpleasant or disagreeable are simply deleted in today's virtual networks. A virtual circle is then created, isolating us from the real world in which we are living. This is the opposite of going out into the periphery. But unfortunately, when we enter into such a situation, when we start to develop blinders to the other, we can become confused. We can develop ideas that are not consistent with reality. And as we reflect upon this, we realize this is something Pope Francis is drawing upon in terms of the tradition that is very deeply rooted. Thomas Aquinas would write about the idea that vices do have the capacity to dull our intellects. And theologian Christina McRory in Theological Studies wrote an article, Moral Reasoning in the World, in which she wrote, if culture can inculcate blind spots in our conscience and deform our embodied sensibilities without our knowledge or initial consent, presumably in doing so, it likewise deforms our reason. At the very least, disabling its operation by distorting the phenomena it perceives. If Aquinas is right that vice can dull our intellectual sight when structures deform our moral habits through the sheer force of repeated incentives to act deficiently, they may also dim our rational faculties. We can think about that in this day and age, I think, as we look at society, And we look at things like the sadness of anti-Semitism, the reality of chattel slavery in this nation, the horrible crimes committed against the Native Americans. And we see that this can be a reality, having an induced blindness that is a part of culture, that is a part of our own, perhaps, upbringing, that makes us feel comfortable in our silos. Pope Francis is calling us to renounce this. And someone who I think's really explicated this quite well is the Jesuit philosopher, theologian Bernard Lonergan, who spoke about a concept called scotosis, which comes from the Greek root skotos, meaning darkness. It's a reference to this idea of having a love of darkness, which is not a conscious act, but arises in the censorship that governs the emergence of psychic contents. In other words, being in ignorance, enjoying being in ignorance, perhaps not even aware of one's ignorance, but nevertheless, as a result, seeing things in only one way and neglecting to understand the reality that is right before us. We need to look at the reality that is right before us. If we don't, one of the things that's important to reflect upon is we miss God. From a Catholic, and also I would say, I'm not excluding a Jewish or a Muslim view in saying this, but certainly from a Christian point of view, God is the creator of a reality. God is reality with a big R. And when we prefer pseudo-reality, when we prefer our own silo, when we prefer our own blindness, we become blind to God who is the healer, to God who can help us to build a culture of care, to God who helps us to enter into conversion when necessary, and to live lives of integrity, lives of healing. If we don't really look at reality for what it is, tragic things can result. Pope Francis specifies certain things that can result when we fall into this induced blindness, this scotosis. Someone is assaulted on our streets and many hurry off as if they did not notice. People hit someone with their car and then flee the scene. Their only desire is to avoid problems. It does not matter that through their fault another person could die. All these are signs of an approach to life that is spreading in various and subtle ways. What is more, caught up as we are with our own needs, the sight of a person who is suffering disturbs us and makes us uneasy, since we have no time to waste on other people's problems. These are the symptoms of an unhealthy society. So we are called to look at reality and to respond accordingly, not to allow our consciences to be blinded, because that is when the worst of atrocities can sadly take place. So once we have seen, we have truly seen, we have delivered ourselves from blindness, we have taken ourselves into the periphery, out of the silos. One of the things that is important, Pope Francis is suggesting for us to embrace, is that human life is a supreme value, that we need first and foremost to look at the other and to cherish the other as the highest value of all. And sadly, Pope Francis at times in the Encyclical points out how this is not always the case. In today's world, many forms of injustice persist, fed by reductive anthropological views and by a profit-based economic model that does not hesitate to exploit, discard, and even kill human beings. While one part of humanity lives in opulence, another part sees its own dignity denied, scorned, or trampled upon, and its fundamental rights discarded or violated. We think about examples like slavery in this country. We think about the sadness of concentration camps in which people were forced to enter into labor. And we realize this has been a truth at times, and even today, that we can sometimes see whole groups of people prefer money to human beings. Paragraph 18 of Fratelli Tutti continues, some parts of our human family, it appears, can be readily sacrificed for the sake of others concerned worthy of a carefree existence. Ultimately, persons are no longer seen as a paramount value to be cared for and respected, especially when they are poor and disabled, not yet useful like the unborn, no longer needed like the elderly. We have grown indifferent to all kinds of wastefulness, starting with the waste of food, which is deplorable to the extreme. So we are being invited to see human beings first, to say the economy exists for people, not people for the economy, to make that choice, and to make that choice in all of the decisions that we enter into. So we have seen through renouncing our blindness, through going into the periphery, we have judged human life as a value, as a supreme value. And now we are called to act, to see, to judge, to act is actually a method that the bishops of Latin America developed. And there is a document that Pope Francis was involved with editing, the Aparecida concluding document of an assembly of the Latin American bishops. He was the editor of this text, and he talked about this method of seeing, judging, acting. So we go into the point now of acting, and how should we act? What the encyclical talks about first and foremost is acting through inclusive dialogue. And throughout the encyclical, he highlights the parable of the Good Samaritan. And he says the decision to include or exclude those lying wounded along the roadside can serve as a criterion for judging every economic, political, social, and religious project. What is going on here is Pope Francis is encouraging us to look at those that others do not look at, to look at them, to listen to them, to make them a part of the dialogue. As I mentioned at the beginning, listening to someone gives that person a sense of dignity, gives that person a sense of being respected. And Pope Francis is inviting us to do that. He becomes rather bold at one point in paragraph 261. He says, "Let us not remain mired in theoretical discussions, but touch the wounded flesh of the victims. Let us look once more at all those civilians whose killing was considered collateral damage. Let us ask the victims themselves. Let us think of the refugees and displaced, those who suffered the effects of atomic radiation or chemical attacks, the mothers who lost their children, and the boys and girls maimed or deprived of their childhood. Let us hear the true stories of these victims of violence, look at reality through their eyes, and listen with an open heart to the stories they tell. In this way, we will be able to grasp the abyss of evil at the heart of war, nor will it trouble us to be deemed naive for choosing peace." So we are called to give a voice to the voiceless, to make sure that they have a voice. And this is certainly in keeping with Christian principles, as well as others. I think we have Matthew 25. Jesus says, "Whatever you did for the least of my brothers or sisters, you did for me." In Matthew 18, "See that you not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven." As we think about this in terms of theology, again, Christina McRory makes the point. In liberation theology, this principle is variously expressed as the hermeneutical or epistemological privilege of the poor, and as the conviction that theological and social transformation must be done by and with, rather than merely for, the poor. And so we see here this idea of let us listen to the other. Let us listen to the other who is not listened to. In the midst of that, we can promote healing. We can promote peace. We can renounce, sadly, the horrific types of behavior that we've reflecting upon together during this week. Pope Francis has invited us to do this together. Now, one of the things that one might note in reflecting on this is that Pope Francis offers general principles, but it doesn't seem there are too many absolute concrete recommendations here. And why is that? Well, I think part of the reason why is Pope Francis is encouraging us to fill in the blanks in our own contexts. He has invited us to listen to each other and to develop together a plan for building up a culture of care. He did something similar when he wrote his apostolic exhortation Evangelii Gaudium. And just to quickly quote from that, he wrote, "I have not sought to offer a complete diagnosis, but I invite communities to complete and enrich these perspectives on the basis of their awareness of the challenges facing them and their neighbor." So we need to think about our own context. We need to think about our own here and now. What can we do to deliver ourselves from a blindness that comes from staying in our silos, not going out into the periphery, having a blindness to the needs of others, neglecting human dignity? What can we do to give a voice to the voiceless so that we might build this culture? Pope Francis has invited all of us to come together, to listen to each other, and dialogue about how best to build a culture of care. As we listen to each other, we've been invited to dream together about ways we can rebuild our broken and fractured world in a way in which hatred is no longer so brutally manifested as we've considered during this conference. May Fratelli Tutti inspire us to enter into a genuine, inclusive dialogue so that all of us might truly be able to love one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Walter, for these important words, very important presentation that illuminates this message from Pope Francis. Father Walter, we have a question from Rabbi Sarah Perman, who wonders, what was the Jewish response to this encyclical? Might you happen to know that?
I'm sorry to say I have not done enough research to offer a clear answer to that, but I can say in general, in numerous interactions I've had with the Jewish community, I have over and over again been told in affirmative ways how different representatives of the Reform, Conservative, Orthodox Jewish communities appreciate the work that Pope Francis is doing in building bridges, and very much so want to be a part of the conversation. So I'm sorry to say I don't have specific texts I could quote to give you examples, but I do know from my own interactions with leadership in the Jewish community that there's been a very positive reception to this approach by Pope Francis to go and to reach out to the other.
Thank you, Father Walt. Early in your presentation, you cite the New Testament first letter of John, which proclaims, "Who claims to love God, yet hates his brother is a liar." Hate is clearly contrary to Jewish and Christian scriptures, as A.J. Levine reminded us in her opening talk on Sunday. Yet hate pervades our airways, our school board meetings, our halls of Congress. Our civil discourse is no longer civil. How can faith leaders and educators address vitriolic language and hateful speech most effectively?
Thank you so much for that wonderful question. And I think I would take my lead with the reflections of the Catholic Church in developing our ecumenical and interreligious dialogues. And that is, first and foremost, we need to look at ourselves. And I think clergy, we need to look at ourselves and see, is there anything in our preaching, in our teaching, that might lead to a siloing, that might lead to an alienation from the other? So we start off always with this idea of self-conversion. What can I do to lead first and foremost by example. And then secondly, to speak out, to give a voice to those who are neglected, and to make clear, no, this is not the answer. The answer is always to try our best to come together and to resolve issues through personal encounter.
Thank you. We have some questions in the chat as well that I'd like to address. You made a point to note that the type of love Pope Francis is inviting humanity to express toward one another is that love of siblings, not necessarily love of neighbor. Do you think that that is an important distinction, the difference between love, neighborly love, and sibling love? And related to that, several of us were wondering perhaps why Pope Francis did not use a more inclusive word. Fratelli is brotherly, and just were wondering if you had any insight and thoughts on that sibling love, and perhaps the title being just in the masculine of sibling love.
Absolutely. I'll start off with the second question. I know that this question of the inclusive language was brought forward, and it certainly is an appropriate one in this day and age. And I do believe that there were responses that were given by the Holy See on that. But I would say more than likely it has to do with the fact that, you know, they're rooting this in a history. This has been rooted in St. Francis, who in his admonitions, he was specifically addressing the brothers in his community. So I think in a sense, it's a quote that leads us to St. Francis. But at the same time, I think Pope Francis has made abundantly clear this is not an exclusive encyclical. This is an encyclical meant for all of us, male and female. So I think that's an important thing to say. I think it's purely that historical reference. Now, in terms of siblings, I think first and foremost, neighbor is certainly a beautiful word. It is a word that our blessed Lord used himself when engaging with others. Who is my neighbor is the question, and he gives a beautiful parable in response. But at the same time, we know that neighbors can move away, while siblings are lifelong, a bond that is always there. And I think that's part of what Pope Francis is encouraging us to do, not to give up, not to say, okay, I'm done with this person, but rather say, no, we're in this for the long term. We're in this forever. And that is certainly important. Siblings also share a common home. They have reassurances, they have resources in common and share responsibility in caring for the home. And they learn to work together in terms of addressing the challenges that are before them. So maybe that's just a little bit on that beautiful phrase, sibling.
Thank you. And our dear brother, Rabbi Gibson, has asked a very important question that helps us think about the continuity of this encyclical with discussion around the preferential care for the poor. Particularly, there have been in some context, in his experience, Rabbi Gibson once wonders that how can we square this statement of preferential love for the poor with perhaps some of the criticism or critique of liberation theology.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I'm not quite sure. What is the question?
McRory, in your presentation, you cite McRory in referencing liberation theology. And there are several questions now in the chat wondering how can we square the preferential love for the poor and some language of liberation theology with members, people are saying members of the U.S. Catholic Church who might reject this theological perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly there are different theological perspectives, and different leaders of the church see pluses and minuses to different movements of theology, including liberation theology. And I think certainly Pope Francis is someone who would promote a very positive view of liberation theology as a way of liberating people from oppression coming from that Latin American experience. But at the same time, there are some concerns. Like I think Pope Benedict had mentioned some concerns about being so concerned with the needs of this world that we neglect the awareness that there is actually a next world. That we have to sort of keep a balance there in terms of just being aware of where the truth lies. Unfortunately, there can be extremes, like the extreme of, well, there's a next world, so don't worry about this world. Pope Francis is saying you can't do that, but at the same time, we can't operate as if this is the only life that exists from a Catholic perspective.
Thank you, Father Walt. Michael Sands asks a very important question, I think is on the minds of many of those who participated in the conference these days. And that is, how can we reconcile or understand the call for interfaith dialogue? And at the same time, we are very much aware of historic moments when the church was silent. Particularly, we learned about the silence before, during, and after the Holocaust. And how might interfaith dialogue help the church to perhaps not be silent? And the question really is, it's perhaps a way to understand, is this an attempt to sort of make up for those silences of the past in history?
I definitely think that is a part of it. We know, especially there was a radical shift in the church with the Second Vatican Council. Second Vatican Council coming in the 60s, with some time to reflect upon the real tragedy, particularly of the Holocaust. And I think that definitely that was an impetus for this shift that involved a major emphasis on interreligious dialogue. At the same time, we can note that with the council comes a whole change in terms of approach to the world, and really to start with that is Ecclesiam Suum, that encyclical I mentioned, where we're looking at the entire world, our engagement, say, with other types of Christians, our engagement with modernity, and we are saying there is another way. The primary means is dialogue. But unfortunately, we do have a past that is regrettable. And thanks be to God that we are talking. And I think it is only when we are able to talk to each other that we can understand the pain of the other. And we can understand how to address that and how to help. And unfortunately, dialogue is messy business. Sometimes mistakes are made. But the key is to keep at it with humility, to keep at it with a spirit of listening. And that can bear fruit.
And so what you're saying is this turn toward the world and engaging in dialogue, this dialogical methodology is not an innovation of Pope Francis, but harkens back to the watershed document of Nostra Aetate. I wonder if Bishop Kulik is still with us. There is some question as to how perhaps both Bishop and Father Kedjierski could respond to how has this encyclical Fratelli Tutti been received by the U.S. Catholic bishops? Do you have a sense of that, either Bishop Kulik as a bishop yourself or Father Kedjierski working with the Conference of Bishops?
Well, maybe I can speak with my limited experience of only having been a bishop now for about 10 months. But I think what we see not only in Fratelli Tutti, but what we see in really the disposition of the Holy Father, and I think it's really coming out particularly in the synod that is coming up, in the synodal process that the Holy Father has embraced and is calling the church to embrace with the bishops, is that Father said something very interesting that in his talk, which is central, the understanding of dialogue. And I think that the church is continuing to evolve in not only its appreciation, but its priority in entering into dialogue. Not only dialogue among the hierarchy and the clergy, but the dialogue with the laity, the church in its fullness. And I think that's really exemplified well in this synodal process, and what all of us are doing throughout our dioceses as we're listening and gathering the thoughts and listening to the hearts and the minds of the faithful. So I think in regards to the USCCB, from my, again, limited perspective, I think we are certainly getting very important cues from the Holy Father as to how he wants to see the governance of the church and the inclusion of all of the members of the church and beyond, the greater community. That's a big part of this synodal process, that we are listening even to not only non-Catholics and even non-Christians, but to look at the whole community. So that just is a little maybe thought there. Maybe Father Kajersky could add to that with his vast experience with USCCB.
Oh, well, I will say I am just a humble servant listening to what all of the bishop's insights, but I'll say a few things. First, if you don't mind, Bishop Kulik, I'd like to build upon what you just said, just with a point that came up recently in a dialogue, and it's the fact that, in this day and age, we are living in a day and age in which people are not so thrilled by pronouncements from above. Well, so this hierarch has issued this decree, and everyone needs to fall in line. That's really not the way people listen as much today. There are some, but not as many. People more listen in the context of dialogue, in which they themselves have the opportunity to speak. And reflect their concerns and work together on those concerns. I think Fratelli Tutti is part of that piece, but I definitely think, Bishop Kulik, that the synod is a real actualization of that for the Catholic Church, in which everyone is given a voice, as you mentioned so well. In terms of the reception of Fratelli Tutti amongst U.S. bishops, I must say my context is the U.S. Bishops' Committee on Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs, which is a committee of bishops. Currently, we have, I think it's 6 bishops on that committee, plus a number of bishops who serve as advisors, and we meet together. And for them, the enthusiasm for Fratelli Tutti is quite tangible. They are really excited in getting the word out there and actualizing this in terms of our dialogues, both at the local level and the national level. But in terms of the U.S. bishops, I think we can say there are sometimes different positions. I think it would be a disservice to say, well, there's just a monolithic, this is the way they think. Like everyone, we sometimes have different people who offer different emphases in terms of a vision. And we see that, I think, at times in various contexts. So I think you can say, from my experience, though, I've heard a lot of positive.
Thank you. That is certainly good news. Thank you both, Bishop and Father Walt, for your very important and I think hope-filled responses to that question of how this document is being received and lived, and the dialogical modality that the Church is now engaging in. This morning, Dr. Afridi sensitized us to the induced blindness, if I may use your phrase, Father Walt, the induced blindness to Muslims victims of genocide. Can you offer specific recommendations to educators and faith leaders in overcoming induced blindness in their students and in their congregants, especially when those students and congregants may not be aware of the scales upon their eyes? Mm-hmm. I would also invite Bishop Kulik, if he has any wisdom on that question as well. How might we help our students, and how may faith leaders help their congregants to overcome induced blindness, particularly when they not be aware of that impairment?
Yes, thank you. That is the question, isn't it? And I wish that we had just a formula, this is what you do. and it is accomplished. It reminds me of when Jules Isaac approached, John the 23rd and said, "Is there hope of overcoming the teaching of contempt in the Catholic Church?" And the answer was, "There's hope, but this is going to require time and reflection, and really, I think the answer is conversion." And conversion is a process that I believe is mysterious. It's something that requires an openness on the part of the other that I believe can only be developed through exposure, through leaving the silo in some way or another, getting individuals to come together. I can do this in different contexts, like teachers. It's interesting. I had a teaching context once in which there were two groups of students present in my class who actually were coming from groups that traditionally had animosity toward each other. So one of the things I did was I paired them up, one from each group, to do projects, and also to do things like to share food, to share fellowship, and eventually things started to change in terms of the attitude. But it doesn't happen instantaneously. But it's a continual call to conversion that we just need to just offer again and again and again, with hope, with patience, because you never know when the dots will be connected. Sometimes it takes time, but I believe this is something mysterious we can't quite define, but it is possible. It has happened. So we just have to create that environment, and I believe hope and pray and work at it with all of our conviction.
I know that the narrative 4 process has been engaged by educators as a way to listen to the narrative of another and then repeat that narrative as a way to walk in the other's shoe, if you will. And I believe one of our deacons here in the Diocese of Greensburg, Deacon Dr. Bill Hisker, has engaged parishes, parishioners in the narrative of their experience of Catholic social doctrine, so that we can begin to hear the stories of others and others' interpretation, understanding, experience with. So I just offer the narrative 4 as one methodology that is available, I think, both to educators and has been engaged in faith communities to help overcome blindness, because certainly this blindness, as Carol Whitner is commenting, seems to pervade our political systems as well. And wondering if you have any thoughts on how the church might help not just congregants overcome, parishioners and all faith leaders help their congregants overcome blindness, but how do we, as religious entities of people of faith, address the blindness of political leaders?
That's very good. And I actually would say Pope Francis has a whole section in the Encyclical on a better politics. And I would encourage people to read that section. But I think about things like one of the issues, of course, is the issue of climate change. And I remember recently Pope Francis mentioned it and said, yes, I once again am mentioning it. He basically said, I know that I'm going to just, in a summary sort of said, I know I'm annoying you, but I'm going to keep on doing it. I'm just going to keep on saying it until it's heard. And I think that's what we need to do. Just continually sound that beat that drum. These are priorities. And sometimes it's easy, I think, to neglect to say things. Oh, well, they've already heard that. I'm just going to forget about it, or to put these values aside because there's just so much pressure. No, we have to be the squeaky wheel. We have to continually stand for what we believe, especially in terms of the dignity of human beings, and not compromise. When we compromise, we have these horrible tragedies we've been reflecting upon the conference.
If I could just add to Father Walter and what we've been talking, I think it's key. As Catholics, our entire sacramental system is based on relationship and on human connectivity. And I think one of the things that's a great challenge, and particularly coming out of this post-COVID time, or the still COVID time, is that, I think all of us were a little fearful, with Zoom conferences and with the explosion of technology and the lack of human connectivity. Were we going to be able to regain that? Were we able to come to even a greater appreciation? And I think we have in many ways come to that greater appreciation. But I think a lot of this starts with relationship and with human connectivity. And when there's human connectivity and people, Helene, you talked a little bit about the telling of the story, but even as Father Walter mentioned, the Holy Father reiterating and repeating, we have to have connectivity with each other beyond just our technology. We have to really enter into relationship. And I think that's exactly what Fratelli Tutti is reminding us of. But I think it starts there, because when we listen to each other and we form a human connectivity, we see the person in a completely different manner. I use the example here in the diocese. We started an international priest program. And of course, our region of Western Pennsylvania, I think, could be a hallmark of parochialism. But the acceptance and the integration of these international priests into our parish communities has been amazing to me, because they are connecting with the people. They're in relationship with the people. They're pastorally present to the people. And I use that as a model because I think our baptismal call calls all of us to be brothers and sisters, and even beyond that, just in our common humanity. And so I think that it really starts with relationship and listening to other people and seeing their perspectives and respecting them and seeing them as people made in the image and likeness of God, differing with opinions and differing theological perspectives, but really in a beautiful way, entering into, as the Holy Father says so often, entering into dialogue with them.
Mm. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Bishop Kulik, for that reflection. And because we are in such close relationship to our elder brothers and sisters in the faith, particularly our Jewish sisters and brothers, we have at least two rabbis on the presentation tonight. There is a comment, a remark about this document, and that is, perhaps, Father Walter, you may be able to help us understand. It doesn't seem in the text we see reference to the Orthodox, and we see reference to Muslim leaders, which is very important and very good, and certainly to communities with which the Catholic Church needs to extend and build relationship and extend dialogue. But there doesn't seem to be mention of our Jewish brothers and sisters specifically, and that is a concern. So I wondered if you might be able to address that.
Yes, I will say, I think that's a point that I don't exactly understand why that is, given that we all know that Pope Francis has an extremely close relationship with Rabbi Abraham Skorka, from when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and I would be surprised if Rabbi Skorka's influence wasn't in this text. I really would. But as to why specifically he wasn't mentioned or others weren't mentioned, I must admit I don't have an answer.
Thank you, though. Thank you for sharing the concern that we have with that. The conference title was Confronting Extremism, Hate, and Denial. And certainly, Father Kajersky, Bishop Kulik, you have given us an opportunity to think about our own role in confronting extremism, hate, and denial, to go to the periphery, to listen, to overcome, and to help others overcome induced blindness, to be genuine in our dialogue, to be able to acknowledge our faults and failings individually and as church, as we have to acknowledge the historical and present limitations and maybe we need to be genuine, I guess, and honest as we engage in dialogue. I just wondered if Jim had any final thoughts, or if there were any other questions that we didn't get to. I think we covered most of them, and I'm so grateful for everyone's engagement in the dialogue tonight. I think it was very fruitful and certainly an appropriate way to end a conversation on dialogue. And certainly dialogue is, I feel, and I'm sure that all of you do as well, the best remedy to extremism, hate, and denial.
Absolutely. I think this was a wonderful session. We probably had more dialogue, more commentary from the audience than on any of our other sessions. And Father Walter, I'm so grateful to you for the way you explained Fratelli Tutti to us, the insight you brought to it, and just the gentleness and the considerateness that you brought to this subject. It was just what we needed. And, we started the conference looking at the Sermon on the Mount. And in many ways, Fratelli Tutti recalls and is informed by the Sermon on the Mount. And indeed, in this time of division and polarization and hatred, it offers a blueprint for us to go forward and to create what you refer to as the culture of care, and to nourish that culture. We need that now very, very badly. We need it more than anything, I think, at this moment in history. So I'm very grateful to you, Father Walter, for being part of the conference and for bringing it to such a wonderful conclusion. Bishop Kulik, I would like to thank you for being here with us this evening. It meant a lot to us to have you contribute to our program. And to the theologian in the family, Helene, I would say thank you as well. I'm just a sociologist, so I'm a little bit out of my depth here, but thank you for handling the discussion and moderating this evening. And to all of our conference participants, I would say that remember that all of our sessions have been recorded and they'll be available for viewing next week. You'll also be receiving a questionnaire asking you to assess the various aspects of the conference. We need your feedback, so please return those to us. It will give us important guidance as we think about planning our future programs. So good evening to all. Blessings on our entire gathering. And I'm just grateful to have ended the conference in the way we have. Again, Father Walter, thank you so much for being with us this evening. And good night to everyone. Have a safe and blessed evening.